January 1945. A gray Pacific dawn settles over a captured coastal village on Luzon. Smoke drifts from burnt-out huts, and the echoes of last night's gunfire fade into the distant hills. Dozens of Japanese women, some former nurses, some clerks, some civilians who fled with retreating units, stand in a tight cluster near a makeshift American aid station. Their clothing is torn, their faces streaked with dust and fear. They have been taught since childhood that capture means dishonor, that American soldiers would brutalize them, that surrender is worse than death. Many had clutched hidden razors or shards of glass only hours earlier, ready to end their lives rather than fall into enemy hands. But what unfolds before them is nothing they expected. An American medic kneels to bandage an injured woman's ankle. Another offers water. A translator calmly explains that no one will be harmed. The women stare in silence, their fear colliding with an unfamiliar reality: discipline, order, and unexpected restraint. And this single morning becomes the lens through which a larger, wartime truth begins to reveal itself. To understand why Japanese female prisoners were so shocked by American behavior, one must first return to the world they inhabited before capture, an environment shaped by years of state-driven indoctrination, cultural pressure, and wartime desperation. By 1944 and 1945, the Japanese Empire was fighting a defensive war across the Pacific, losing territory island by island as American forces advanced with increasing speed and overwhelming firepower. Every civilian, including women, became part of a national narrative built on sacrifice, obedience, and unwavering loyalty to the emperor. From the earliest stages of Japan's imperial expansion, schools and community organizations taught one lesson relentlessly: the enemy is merciless. Propaganda films, newspapers, and military pamphlets repeated terrifying claims about what Americans would do to women and children, stories designed to harden the population's will to resist. Women were told that capture would bring humiliation, abuse, and certain death. The message was simple: surrender was not an option. Fighting or dying was the only honorable path. These ideas penetrated deeply, especially in rural communities and among young women serving military-adjacent roles. By the time the war reached its final phase, tens of thousands of Japanese women found themselves on islands transformed into battlefields. Some worked as nurses in frontline field hospitals. Others served as typists, radio assistants, and administrative clerks in military headquarters. Many were simply civilians swept into the conflict as Japan fortified positions in the Philippines, the Marianas, and Okinawa. But regardless of their role, the message they carried into the war was the same: Americans would not treat them as human beings. At the same time, the American military machine was expanding at a scale Japan could no longer match. In 1943 and 1944, the United States launched massive offensives across the Central and Southwest Pacific: Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, Iwo Jima, and with each victory came thousands of Japanese dead, but very few prisoners. This reinforced American assumptions that the Japanese would not surrender, and it reinforced Japanese assumptions that Americans would kill them even if they tried. Yet behind the chaos of combat, American policy toward prisoners was structured, codified, and heavily influenced by the Geneva Conventions. Commanders were repeatedly instructed to treat captured civilians and military personnel with discipline and humanity, not merely for moral reasons, but for strategic ones. Humane treatment encouraged surrender, reduced resistance, and provided intelligence opportunities. But Japanese civilians had no way of knowing this. Their world remained shaped by fear-driven narratives that warned of the wound. Opposite, these opposing belief systems set the stage for a profound psychological collision as American forces approached Japan's outer defenses. On islands like Saipan and Guam, civilians, including women and children, jumped from cliffs or hid in burning buildings rather than risk capture. The Japanese military sometimes encouraged these acts, reinforcing the idea that Americans would commit atrocities. But the reality awaiting those who survived or were captured was nothing like the terrifying image they carried in their minds. American soldiers were often shocked by the civilians' fear. Reports describe attempts to coax families out of caves using translators, doctors, and even loudspeakers playing calm messages. Some women emerged trembling, clutching infants, expecting immediate violence. Instead, they were processed, examined, and escorted to safe zones for food and medical care. These early encounters began to spread quietly among survivors, forming the first cracks in the wall of propaganda they had grown up with. By the time the Philippines campaign intensified in late 1944, the psychological divide became even more pronounced. Japanese female auxiliaries, many of them barely in their 20s, found themselves facing the reality of American capture for the first time. Their fear was not merely emotional, but cultural, shaped by generations of training centered on honor, shame, purity, and national duty. Yet the treatment they received challenged everything they believed about the enemy. It is within this world of fear, indoctrination, and collapsing defenses that the story of unexpected fairness truly begins to take shape. A story shaped by policy, culture, and the lived experiences of thousands of women who discovered that the enemy they were taught to fear did not act as expected. As the Pacific War entered its final, catastrophic years, the gap between Japanese expectations and American military conduct widened further. This divergence can only be understood by examining the systems guiding each side, the ideological, structural, and legal frameworks that shaped how captors and prisoners interacted. The American Armed Forces and World War II operated under a doctrine rooted in the 1929 Geneva Conventions, even though Japan itself had not ratified the agreement. For U.S. leadership, adherence to these standards was not simply a moral stance. It was a matter of international responsibility and a reflection of national identity. Manuals for U.S. personnel repeatedly emphasized the lawful treatment of prisoners, the prohibition of unnecessary force, and the requirement to provide medical care irrespective of nationality. Officers were trained to maintain strict discipline, not only during combat, but also in handling civilians and post. This approach contrasted sharply with the imperial ideology shaping Japanese wartime society. The Japanese military viewed surrender as a disgraceful act that violated the warrior ethos known as Bushido. Soldiers were conditioned to prefer death over capture, a mindset passed down through schools, media, and government institutions. Civilians absorbed similar messages, learning that surrendering to Western forces meant loss of dignity, cultural defilement, or worse. For women, whose societal roles were deeply intertwined with ideas of purity and self-sacrifice, the fear was particularly intense. They believed that the enemy saw them not as non-combatants, but as targets. Japan's refusal to adopt Geneva standards allowed military leaders to portray allied nations as unbound by any moral code. Reports and posters warned women that American soldiers would treat them with cruelty the moment they fell into enemy hands. Stories many fabricated circulated through villages and barracks about supposed atrocities that had never occurred. These tales were designed to strengthen resistance and make civilians reluctant to surrender. The intended message was clear: the enemy does not value your life. Only your nation does. However, American field commanders encountered a very different operational reality. As they advanced island by island, they discovered that the Japanese willingness to fight to the death resulted in staggering casualties on both sides. The capture of civilians, especially women and children, became increasingly critical to reducing the bloodshed. To encourage surrender, American units frequently prepared leaflets, broadcasts, and safe zones. They understood that behavior at the moment of contact would determine whether civilians resisted or emerged from hiding. This evolving American strategy soon revealed itself during campaigns in the Marianas, the Philippines, and Okinawa. Medical teams, often accompanied by interpreters, approached caves and bunkers cautiously, offering food and water as signs of goodwill. When women finally stepped out, trembling and expecting brutal treatment, they encountered instead a system designed to stabilize them: triage stations, supply tents, and military police ensuring order rather than chaos. While conditions were far from perfect, war never offers perfection. The degree of structure stood in stark contrast to the terror civilians had imagined. Reports from the U.S. Army and Navy describe how surprised many women were when they realized the Americans were not acting out the roles propaganda had assigned them. Some refused food at first, believing it to be poisoned. Others fainted when they realized they would not be harmed. Nurses and Red Cross workers documented cases of women who broke down in confusion when treated with unexpected gentleness, after months of hearing only warnings of cruelty. As these encounters accumulated, they challenged the deeply rooted belief systems women had carried into the war. For many, it was their first direct contact with foreigners. The Americans seemed alien in appearance, language, and behavior, but their actions contradicted every story the Japanese state had fed its people. What emerged was a complex interplay between cultural fear and military procedure. Women who had been conditioned to see the enemy as inhuman discovered themselves being treated within a framework of law and order. And American personnel, many of them young, unprepared for such cultural differences, learned that compassion could break through barriers propaganda had built for years. This widening contrast set the stage for the personal stories, emotional shifts, and strategic implications that would define the heart of this documentary. And these angles now reveal themselves as central threads in understanding what happened next. For Japanese women, surrender was not merely a military act, it was the collapse of an entire worldview. Many had grown up under a national education system that tied personal worth to loyalty and sacrifice. When the moment of capture came, they expected violence, humiliation, or forced separation from their families. Instead, they encountered American soldiers who followed structured procedures: disarmament, identification, medical checks, and placement into controlled safe zones. This produced a psychological rupture. Women who had prepared themselves for death found their captors treating them with restraint and consistency. The shock was immediate, and visible stares of confusion, trembling hands slowly lowering makeshift weapons, whispered questions to one another about why the enemy was offering water instead of punishment. The transition from imagined brutality to witnessed discipline created a profound emotional shift, one that would ripple through every subsequent experience they had under American control, forming the foundation upon which all other angles would build. American field medics played an unexpectedly central role in shaping the experiences of captured women. Trained to prioritize wounds over nationality, they approached Japanese prisoners with the same systematic care they offered their own wounded. Women with burns, dehydration, infections, or battlefield injuries were treated using standardized triage methods that emphasized efficiency, clinical detachment, and respect for life. For women who had been told that Americans would harm them physically, the sight of a medic cleaning a wound or a nurse adjusting a bandage felt surreal. Many resisted at first, interpreting medical intervention as a threat. But repeated interactions began to break down fear. Even simple gestures like offering blankets, water, or morphine became powerful counterweights to years of propaganda. This predictable pattern of care transformed the atmosphere. Women who had entered captivity expecting torment instead found themselves in the care of an institution guided by rules, not revenge. Their disbelief became a defining feature of their early testimonies. Despite the discipline shown by American troops, misunderstandings were inevitable. The gap between Japanese and American cultural norms, especially regarding gender roles, communication, and personal space, created moments of confusion that required delicate handling. American soldiers often interpreted silence as hostility, while Japanese women viewed it as a necessary expression of modesty and fear. Gestures meant as reassurance could easily be misread. Even the act of separating men and women during intake, done by Americans for organizational purposes, unsettled some women who saw separation as a precursor to harm. Yet through interpreters, observation, and consistent behavior, many misunderstandings gradually faded. American personnel began to recognize the depth of fear embedded in these women, while the women themselves learned that their captors were following procedures rather than impulses. These moments of cross-cultural adjustment did not erase the trauma of war, but they created the first fragile pathways toward trust, setting the stage for deeper angles to emerge. And from these evolving perceptions comes a broader set of forces, strategic, moral, and political, that shaped every interaction still to come. The stark contrast between Japanese expectations and American behavior was rooted in two fundamentally different wartime doctrines. The Imperial Japanese military framed war as a moral test requiring absolute sacrifice. Surrender was equated with shame, and enemy capture was portrayed as a fate worse than death. This belief system was reinforced through school curricula, public speeches, and military training manuals. Women, in particular, were told that Allied soldiers would violate or kill them on sight. The United States, however, mobilized under a framework that emphasized adherence to international law, military professionalism, and strategic utility. Fair treatment of prisoners was not solely an ethical decision. It was calculated to encourage future surrenders, reduce resistance, and gather intelligence. American commanders understood that women and children were often the first to reveal cracks in the defensive lines of Japanese positions. By treating them humanely, they could weaken Japanese morale without additional combat. This divide between psychological warfare and legal military doctrine explains why Japanese women were so unprepared for the orderliness they encountered. They walked into captivity expecting a nightmare and instead found a system built on regulation and restraint, something their wartime culture had never prepared them to imagine. Asterisk. American after-action reports, medical logs, and intelligence briefings provide remarkable insight into the emotional responses of Japanese female prisoners. In campaigns from Japan to Okinawa, field commanders repeatedly noted that women expressed extreme terror, confusion, and disbelief when treated gently. Some attempted suicide upon seeing Americans approach, only to be physically restrained by medics attempting to save them. There are recorded instances of women refusing food for days, fearing poisoning until witnessing others eat safely. Some wept openly when given clean clothing or blankets, gestures that contradicted every story they had been told. Red Cross nurses reported that women often apologized repeatedly, convinced that they might be punished for receiving care. Interrogation teams also documented a recurring pattern. Once women realized they would not be harmed, they became more willing to speak. Their testimonies provided valuable insight into Japanese defensive strategies, civilian morale, and supply shortages. Yet beyond intelligence value, these reports capture the human dimension of war, fear transformed into stunned relief as expectations collided with reality, while compassion played a role. American humane treatment also carried practical military benefits. Intelligence officers observed that when civilians, especially women, survived their first encounter with American troops unharmed, word spread quickly through the surrounding hills and caves. This sometimes encouraged additional surrenders, reducing resistance and limiting further casualties on both sides. Furthermore, the treatment of female prisoners became a symbolic demonstration of American discipline. Commanders understood that misconduct could reinforce Japanese propaganda and prolong the war. Maintaining order protected operational integrity and upheld international credibility. Yet beyond strategy, The encounters forced many American soldiers to confront the humanity of those they had been fighting. Seeing terrified women clutching children or wounded auxiliaries, trembling in fear softened some attitudes hardened by months of brutal combat. War had conditioned them to expect fanatic resistance. Instead, they found people whose fear was shaped by misinformation rather than malice. This intersection of military necessity and moral responsibility underscored one of the war's most profound realities. Even in the Pacific's harshest campaigns, the conduct of armies could challenge entire belief systems. And as these angles converged, they shaped the decisive turning points that would define the remainder of this story. The decisive turning point in this story emerged during the final major battles of the Pacific, when the scale of Japanese civilian presence collided directly with the overwhelming force of the American advance. On islands such as Saipan in 1944, Leyte in late 1944, and Okinawa in 1945, the presence of thousands of Japanese women nurses, clerks, labor auxiliaries, and ordinary civilians created a scenario unlike earlier island campaigns. Here, the psychological battle that had simmered quietly for years erupted into a dramatic confrontation between expectation and reality. Among these campaigns, Okinawa stands out as the most revealing. By April 1945, the island had become one of Japan's last defensive bulwarks. The Imperial Army mobilized not only soldiers, but thousands of civilian women, many of them teenagers, to serve as medical assistants, communications aides, and logistical workers. Known as the Student Nurse Corps and Auxiliary Support Teams, these women were placed in field hospitals, carved into limestone caves environments filled with the wounded, the dying, and the constant echo of artillery from these caves. American forces were portrayed as an existential threat. Propaganda officers warned women that if captured, they would face torture, enslavement, or worse. Many believed these claims wholeheartedly. As U.S. Marines and Army units approached the cave networks, panic spread among the women inside. Some prepared suicide charges with grenades. Others sharpened pieces of rebar or kept shards of broken glass hidden in their clothing. They awaited what they believed would be their final moments. But as the Americans advanced, the reality unfolding outside the cave entrances was dramatically different from anything these women had imagined. American units, aware that civilians were likely inside, approached cautiously with translators and medics. Loudspeakers broadcast assurances in Japanese: "You will not be harmed. Surrender, and you will receive medical care. Come out slowly and unarmed." Inside the caves, the women hesitated. Some believed it was a trap. Others clung to the belief that an honorable death was preferable to the humiliation of capture. The tension built hour by hour as more artillery strikes shook the entrances. Finally, the first women emerged, some crawling, some limping, some carrying the severely wounded. They shielded their faces, expecting blows or execution. Instead, American medics rushed forward, not with weapons drawn, but with stretchers, bandages, and canteens of water. The women were stunned. The soldiers spoke firmly, but without aggression, directing them toward designated aid stations. Wounded Japanese soldiers lying alongside the women received treatment as well. The shock on the faces of the female auxiliaries was unmistakable. One American officer later wrote in a field report, "They were trembling as if expecting the worst." When no harm came, many broke down weeping. They seemed unable to believe what they were seeing. In the hours that followed, dozens more emerged. Some had been told Americans would kill infants. When they saw medics carrying children gently down the slope, many collapsed in disbelief. The transformation of fear into astonishment was so widespread that American units began documenting these reactions as part of their operational intelligence. Summaries at this moment repeated across multiple caves and encampments marked a profound shift in the psychological landscape of the battle. Japanese women had expected annihilation. Instead, they found themselves inside a structured system that prioritized their survival. But the turning point was not only emotional. It carried strategic weight. As more women realized they would not be harmed, word spread to nearby hiding places. Civilians who had been preparing suicide attempts began surrendering instead. Entire groups, dozens at a time, walked cautiously toward American lines, waving makeshift white flags. For the Americans, this shift was equally striking. Soldiers who anticipated fanatical resistance were confronted with the human cost of propaganda. The sight of terrified women and children emerging from smoke-filled caves forced many to reassess their understanding of the enemy. That convergence, fear giving way to relief, hostility dissolving under discipline, stands as the pivotal moment when the narrative changed. A moment when both sides witnessed something neither fully expected, and it set the stage for the deeper consequences that would follow. Consequences that shaped not only the remainder of the battle, but also the post-war understanding of human behavior under total war. As the battles intensified, the psychological shift that began at the cave mouths evolved into a broader transformation, one that affected the momentum of entire operations. The surrender of Japanese female auxiliaries and civilians, once unthinkable, now began to occur in patterns that American commanders could measure. The single moment of disbelief experienced by the first groups of women rippled outward, becoming a catalyst that altered the complexion of the battlefield. On Okinawa, where the density of the civilian population dwarfed that of earlier campaigns, the change was dramatic. Word spread through whispers, hand signs, and hurried conversations between families hiding in ravines and bombed-out shelters. Women who had seen their neighbors emerge unharmed began to reevaluate what the Imperial Army had told them. Some still hesitated, torn between indoctrinated fear and the faint hope offered by the Americans' consistent behavior. But as testimony accumulated, surrender became less a rumor and more a lived experience. American field commanders recognized the significance of this shift. Military intelligence units documented a notable decrease in resistance among certain pockets of civilians once initial contact proved nonviolent. Teams were deployed specifically to manage surrendering groups, creating safe corridors and protected gathering points. The goal was twofold: reduce the need for force and prevent unnecessary casualties. This strategic approach succeeded most visibly among women and children, who were often the first to respond to changing conditions. Yet even as surrender became more common, the emotional turmoil faced by Japanese women remained intense. Many approached American lines trembling uncontrollably, still expecting betrayal at the last moment. They had grown up hearing that Westerners valued life differently, that they were culturally incapable of respecting captured enemies. Some feared being separated from their families permanently. Others worried that capture would ruin their honor irreparably. The visual reality of American treatment-structured intake medical care. Guarded safe zones conflicted sharply with these lifelong beliefs, creating a profound internal struggle for American soldiers. These encounters revealed a side of the war that earlier island campaigns had rarely shown. Soldiers accustomed to fierce, often suicidal resistance found themselves guiding women and children to safety. Marines who had fought hand-to-hand on the ridges now carried elderly civilians on their backs. Army medics documented cases where they treated wounds inflicted not by American firepower but by Japanese grenades used in suicide attempts. Such events forced many Americans to confront the depth of fear encoded into the civilians' worldview. The turning point became even more pronounced when Japanese nurses and student auxiliaries began participating in organized surrender. Some had stayed behind in collapsing field hospitals long after military units retreated. Their decision to surrender after witnessing American care for wounded they had brought out on stretchers provided powerful evidence to civilians still hiding. Reports circulated of American doctors refusing to prioritize their own wounded over Japanese patients, treating whoever was most critically injured first. This act alone shattered one of the most entrenched pieces of wartime propaganda. Intelligence officers noted that once women realized they would not be mistreated, they became more willing to provide information, not out of malice toward their homeland, but from the simple human recognition that cooperation seemed safer than silence. They described the layout of remaining caves, the presence of wounded soldiers, and the dwindling supplies that made continued resistance untenable. These contributions played a subtle yet meaningful role in the Americans' ability to anticipate pockets of resistance and reduce further bloodshed. But the most powerful impact of this turning point lay not in strategy, but in its emotional and symbolic weight. For Japanese women who surrendered, the moment reshaped their entire understanding of the enemy. For American soldiers, it challenged stereotypes about Japanese civilians as unwaveringly hostile or indoctrinated. The battlefield, once defined by absolute separation, now contained glimpses of shared humanity. Still, the shift did not occur everywhere or for everyone. Many Japanese soldiers enforced strict controls on civilians, preventing them from surrendering. Others carried out or encouraged forced suicides to avoid capture. The tragedy of these acts stands in stark contrast to the experiences of women who reached American lines and survived. Their stories highlight how propaganda, fear, and desperation coexisted with moments of compassion and restraint. By the time the major resistance on Okinawa collapsed, the turning point had become undeniable. The encounters between American forces and Japanese women revealed one of the war's most unexpected truths, that even in the most brutal environments, human behavior could defy expectation, and with the turning point established, the aftermath would show how these moments shaped not only the close of the Pacific War, but also the memories and testimonies that followed in later decades. When the dust settled on the Pacific's final battlefields, the experiences of Japanese female prisoners formed an often overlooked but deeply revealing part of the war's closing chapter. The surrender of these women, once deemed unimaginable, became a window into how fear, indoctrination, and lived reality collided in the final months of the conflict. Their survival, and how they were treated, shaped not only their individual lives, but also broader post-war narratives about the nature of the enemy and the meaning of humanity in total war. In the immediate aftermath of each campaign, American forces faced the challenge of caring for thousands of displaced civilians. Women were often placed in designated safe areas away from active combat zones, where they received food rations, medical treatment, and temporary shelter. Military police monitored the camps, preventing chaos, while Red Cross personnel and medical teams handled the overwhelming flow of the wounded and malnourished. Despite limited resources and the pressures of ongoing operations, the Americans maintained a structured environment that contrasted sharply with Japanese propaganda. For many women, this period marked the first time they had experienced a sense of physical security since the war had reached their shores. Testimonies recorded in the months and years that followed describe a mixture of relief and confusion. Some women spoke of crying uncontrollably when they realized they would not be assaulted or separated from their families. Others described how the simple act of receiving clean water or a blanket felt like an emotional shock. Small gestures carried immense weight in the minds of people who had been preparing for a violent death. Meanwhile, American commanders began compiling detailed reports documenting the conditions of the civilians they had encountered. These reports were valuable not only for military intelligence, but also for humanitarian planning. They revealed widespread malnutrition, untreated wounds, and psychological trauma among Japanese women and children. Many had spent weeks hiding in caves or ruined villages before emerging. Some had lost family members to forced suicides encouraged by military officials who warned that Americans would show no mercy The contrast between expectation and experience became a recurring theme in these records. American officers noted with some astonishment how often women expressed disbelief at being treated fairly. One officer from the 96th Infantry Division wrote that women looked at medical staff as though unsure whether the care was genuine. Another reported that even after days in safe zones, some still hesitated to approach soldiers directly, expecting punishment for unknown transgressions. This aftermath period also illuminated the tragic consequences of Japanese propaganda. Many women who survived later admitted that they had nearly taken their own lives, some more than once, because they believed it was the honorable or necessary choice. The fact that their lives were spared not through surrender alone, but through humane treatment challenged deeply held cultural narratives that would take years to unravel. For American soldiers, the interactions left lasting impressions as well. Many had entered the war with hardened views shaped by the brutality of earlier battles. The willingness of civilians, especially women, to trust them slowly and hesitantly forced some to reconsider the nature of the enemy they had been fighting. Letters written home and post-war memoirs often described these encounters as some of the most emotionally complex moments of their service. By the time the major campaigns closed, the unprecedented survival of thousands of Japanese women had become one of the unexpected legacies of the Pacific War. Their stories would quietly influence occupation policies, humanitarian efforts, and later historical understanding. Yet the aftermath did not end here. The deeper consequences, social, political, and personal, continued to unfold long after the fighting ceased, shaping how history remembered these encounters. As Japan moved towards surrender in August 1945, the experiences of women who had encountered American forces earlier in the war took on new meaning. Their survival and the unexpected fairness they witnessed stood in stark contrast to the narratives that had dominated Japanese society for more than a decade. But this contrast did not immediately erase the emotional scars left by propaganda, nor did it smooth the transition into the uncertain world of post-war occupation. When American forces landed in Japan for the formal occupation, they encountered a population bracing for the worst. Yet reports from Okinawa, Saipan, Guam, and the Philippines had already circulated among Allied leadership. These reports showed that when Japanese civilians, especially women, were approached with discipline, structure, and predictability, the outcomes were dramatically different from the brutal resistance of earlier battles. This understanding influenced policies governing the occupation, a commitment to maintain order while avoiding humiliation, a focus on stabilizing communities, and the careful handling of vulnerable populations. Women who had been prisoners or displaced civilians found themselves at the center of these efforts. Many had endured physical and emotional hardship long before encountering American forces. Now, as Japan struggled with food shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and mass displacement, their survival depended on a fragile partnership between the occupying military and local communities. Relief stations, food distribution centers, and medical clinics sprang up across devastated cities. Women who had once feared American soldiers often became some of the first to approach these centers, recognizing that the structure and fairness they had witnessed earlier was not an anomaly but a deliberate policy. For some women, the aftermath brought opportunities to share their experiences, though this was not always easy. Wartime indoctrination had placed a heavy burden on concepts of honor and shame. Admitting that surrender had led to humane treatment could be interpreted as undermining the sacrifices of those who had died believing otherwise. As a result, many women kept their stories private for decades. Only later, through oral histories, interviews, and memoirs, did the fuller picture begin to emerge. These testimonies reveal a striking pattern. Women often described the moment of surrender as the most terrifying of their lives, followed by profound relief. They recalled the discipline of American soldiers, the structure of intake procedures, and the consistent application of rules rather than arbitrary force. They also remembered the confusion, how kindness felt unfamiliar after months or years of hearing that the enemy had no humanity. This emotional journey became one of the most significant legacies of their experience. The occupation period deepened these impressions. Many women worked in reconstruction efforts alongside American personnel, serving as translators, clerical assistants, or logistical workers. These interactions further reinforced that their treatment during surrender had not been accidental. It reflected a broader approach that prioritized stability, professionalism, and adherence to established codes of conduct. At the same time, the aftermath exposed the human consequences of wartime propaganda. Families mourned relatives who had died in suicides encouraged by false claims. Communities reassessed the messages that had been promoted by the wartime government. For the first time, survivors compared their lived experiences with the fears they had once believed unquestioningly. This process was painful, but it became essential to Japan's post-war reckoning. In the broader historical narrative, the stories of Japanese women who surrendered and survived became evidence of how misinformation can shape behavior on a massive scale. Their experiences challenged stereotypes on both sides of the Pacific and demonstrated that even in a war defined by extreme brutality, moments of restraint could alter the course of individual lives. By the time the occupation ended in 1952, many women who had once trembled at the sight of an American uniform now associated it with fairness, food, medical care, and order. Their testimonies add a nuanced layer to the history of the Pacific War, one that complicates simple narratives of enemies and atrocities, and one that reveals how deeply human beings respond to dignity when it is offered unexpectedly. And from these aftermaths, a final truth emerges: a reflection on humanity, fear, and the fragile ways in which war reshapes the human understanding of friend and foe. In the end, the story of Japanese female prisoners who encountered American forces is not simply a chapter of wartime history. It is a reminder of how profoundly human beings are shaped by what they are taught to fear. These women entered the final stages of the Pacific War believing that capture would mean the loss of everything: their dignity, their safety, their lives. Instead, they found a reality defined not by brutality, but by discipline, structure, and a level of restraint that challenged everything they had been told. Their experiences show that even in the most destructive conflicts, moments of unexpected humanity can break through the layers of fear and propaganda that war constructs. The American treatment of these women was not perfect, nor was it free of the harshness that inevitably surrounds military operations. But its consistency, its adherence to procedure, law, and restrained conduct revealed something larger about the nature of the conflict. It demonstrated that war is not only fought with weapons, but also with beliefs, and that those beliefs can collapse when confronted by lived experience. For the women who survived, this collision between expectation and reality became a defining memory. Some carried the confusion for years before speaking openly about it. Others remembered it as the moment they first questioned narratives that had seemed unquestionable. Through their testimonies, we gain a glimpse not only into the brutality of total war, but also into the small gestures that can transform fear into understanding. This story also reminds us that history is rarely defined by a single truth. The Pacific War was marked by horrific violence, cultural misunderstanding, and devastating losses on all sides. Yet within that landscape existed moments where humanity persisted, quiet, disciplined, and deeply impactful. The experiences of these women are part of that complexity. They reveal that even in the harshest environments, a measured act of fairness can echo far beyond the battlefield. Their story endures as a testament to the fragile, unexpected spaces where compassion survives, and to how profoundly such moments can reshape the memories of those who lived through them.